Is Luke Acts a companion of the Apostle Paul? In what ways does Luke Acts contradict Paul's letters? Today, I am joined by Paula Fredriksen. Thanks to everybody who helped make this trip possible. We also venture off into some work by Robin Faith Walsh. There's all sorts of neat stuff in all of these videos. I want to say thank you to those who've joined our Patreon. I hope you enjoy this video. Dr. Paula Fredriksen. Now, we know that the apologists are right about everything, but, okay, bad way to start the video off. Right. On a serious note, there have been Christian apologists who cringe when they see some of my videos because I have Jennifer Bird, or I'll have Shelley Matthews coming up, or I'll have Steve Mason talk about how Luke Acts seems to know Josephus' writings from 93 AD. He's saying that he's convinced by it, right? Or I'll mention Richard Purvo or any other academic. Mm-hmm. They get like, oh no. Because Luke Acts was written by the traveling companion of Paul. And I approach this in different ways of like, how do we date this material? Should we say this is early 2nd century material, or at least late 1st century at best? And then the other way I kind of want to challenge this idea is that, well, he doesn't even agree with Paul's letters. So if he's with Paul and he knows Paul that well, why does him and Paul not agree? And some of these apologists, I guess, will find ways out of it. But for the regular people who might be watching, who are interested in really seeking the information from an academic such as yourself, sorry, this is long-winded, does Luke Acts contradict Paul, and can you give us any examples of how we know that?
First of all, people want to think that Luke is a traveler companion of Paul because of the we passages. And the reason scholars date Acts to the early 2nd century is because of the word Christian, which shows up in Luke, which appears and clusters in early 2nd century texts, both in Pliny and in Tacitus and in Ignatius and in Luke Acts. So if Luke Acts is writing then, he's awfully long-lived if he was a companion of Paul. And if he was a companion of Paul, he hadn't read Paul's letters, because there are some head-on collisions with the material in, say, Galatians and the material in Luke. Luke has Paul start out in Jerusalem, be commissioned by, this is all fantasy because the high priest didn't even have authority over the Dead Sea Scroll community, and they're right down the street, right? He's deputizing Paul to go all the way to Damascus to crash heads and drag Christians back to Jerusalem for I don't know what end. And Paul is on the road to Damascus, and he has this experience. And then he goes immediately back to, as soon as he can, back to Jerusalem. Paul says that he implies that he was in Damascus the whole time. He resists this movement before he has his transitional experience. Then he says he goes away to Arabia, which is Roman Arabia, not Saudi Arabia. He goes east for 3 years, which however long a period that is. And then he goes back to Damascus, he says. And then after several years, I go up to Jerusalem. So you can't both go back to Jerusalem immediately after your so-called conversion experience and go after 3.5 years. So I think that's a problem. The other thing is what Paul doesn't mention that Luke attributes to Paul. When Paul is boasting of his Jewish credentials, how he was circumcised on the 8th day of the people Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrew parents, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. I got a PhD under Gamaliel. It's not there. When he talks about, I persecuted the ecclesia, the assembly of God, and tried to destroy it, never mentioned Stephen. Why not? I mean, if those were such fundamental moments in his biography. So there are the gaps that Paul doesn't mention from Luke, and there are the collisions that Acts has with Paul's letters. And for that reason, I don't think the author Luke was familiar with Paul's letters, or if he was, he wasn't reading them very carefully.
I've even heard, and I'm just going to throw out some other ideas because I'm certain there's more. There's probably plenty of these examples we could find, that when he went in his letters, when he says he persecuted, he probably meant something similar to the way he was lashed as in synagogues. In a similar sense, he may have been in a position where he may have done to others what was done to him in terms of these lashes, which is a common like intra-Jewish
disciplinary action. And if it happened in the diaspora, which is where I assume it happened, you have to choose to submit to it because you could walk away otherwise. And it's by disciplinary, it's incorporative. That's the reason for it, is that you want to continue to be part of the community. Josephus mentions lashing done if somebody's cheap, if they don't give enough charity. So, I mean, there's all sorts of, so who knows what, and you can't, obviously, it's not lashing like Mel Gibson, right? Or you wouldn't get up and walk away afterwards. So it's probably a symbolic gesture. And also, Paul himself complains about being persecuted. And Paul has a persecution complex. I mean, he's persecuted by pagans, he's persecuted by Roman authorities, he's persecuted. Any kind of resistance, any kind of headwind he encounters, he processes as persecution. And there's a reason for that, because he's identifying with the suffering phase of Jesus, which is a very oblique reference to the historical Jesus, right, who suffered on the cross. Mm-hmm. And he's also combating pagan gods, whom Jesus is going to defeat when he comes back. So he's identifying with Jesus in the persecution phase, and he's identifying with Jesus in the victorious phase as well. He's sort of like establishing a beachhead against these pagan gods, and Jesus is going to destroy them in 1 Corinthians 15, or he's going to humble them in Philippians 2, all those superhuman knees above the earth, upon the earth, and below the earth that bend to Jesus. So Jesus is going to take care of the pagan gods, but Paul's already defying the God of this world who's blinded the mind of unbelievers in 2 Corinthians 4:4. So he's fighting pagan gods in order to take his message to pagans and turn them into ex-pagans. And if there's one thing we can say about Mediterranean gods, is that they had a thing about being shown respect. So if you have ex-pagan pagans, you're endangering the city because you're destabilizing the treaty between heaven and earth, where the gods take care of the city.
Mm-hmm. That really blew my mind as a layman learning this, as to why maybe there was persecution from pagans and why they were, in a sense, out to oust Christians who were, pulling these non-Israel.
Well, it's also endangering for the synagogue communities, which is probably why Paul was lashed. I mean, there's only one place in town where a message of only worship the God of Israel and stop worshiping idols is going to come from. And that's the synagogue. And here's the synagogue comfortably embedded for centuries in the Greco-Roman religious institution of the city. And all of a sudden, they're putting the security of this radioactively apocalyptic Jewish movement, which I think is starting out from the synagogue. Mm-hmm. I think I'm comfortable dealing with Acts as telling us something, because antecedently it makes sense to deal with biblically literate. Otherwise, Paul would have had a biblical literacy instant program that the Methodists would want to copyright, right? So it's destabilizing socially Tertullian talks about this. If the Nile, if the Tiber overflows or the Nile doesn't, if the earth moves or the sun doesn't, all at once the cries go up, the Christians to the lion. It's because you're destabilizing the friendly relation between heaven and earth if you're not showing the gods respect. And that's why the gods are on Paul's back. He complains about the God of this world.
Who is that God of this world?
I think he doesn't name the God, but it's not Satan, because he has no trouble naming Satan when he wants to.
Do you think he has a demiurge idea, like some people want to try and put? I mean, Gnosticism love to use him in their pedigree. Like we come from Paul. And
Gnosticism has a hostile demiurge. A demiurge in that intellectual matrix of Middle Platonism is the God who does the moving around and ordering of matter for the high God who doesn't move. And so Christ is the person who does that, through whom all things are made, right?
Right.
Christ is a demiurgical figure for Paul, although Paul insists that he's an anthropos, a man, but he's ex oranos, from heaven. So he's a special superhuman figure whose humanity Paul insists on, but also insists on this elevated metaphysical position as well.
Just makes me wonder, because some of these traditions may have taken Paul a little too far, and of course, we get new ideas over time. Just back to the Luke Acts Paul thing, a lot of the scholars, like Pervo and others that I've read carefully, will say that Paul even stops identifying himself toward the end as a Jew in Luke Acts. Never in his letters does he ever even pretend. Like, throughout the whole thing, he struggles through the synagogues and Acts in this narrative. But at the end, and I can't remember the pericope, the exact phrase, but it was Pervo who noticed it and went, he's saying like those Jews, like almost like I'm not one of them anymore kind of ideas. And it makes you wonder if Luke Acts is breaking away, kind of like John does, where it's like those Judaios, those blaming the Jews. And
it's hard to tell, because he also has Paul who's goes to the synagogue every Sabbath and worships in the temple at the end. And P.S. he's going to the synagogue in Rome.
That's a good point.
So he's still in, and it could be those Jews, the ones over there who I'm having a fight with, right, is the way to look at it, not the Jews.
Do you think John's doing the Jews?
I think John is its own continent of scholarship. First of all, I'm not a John guy. I'm more of a Mark guy.
Right.
I think what John is doing is trying to create a polarized. This is the work of Adele Reinhardt's Cast Out of the Covenant. What he's doing is, with his rhetoric, trying to make a wedge between his group and Judaioi. So there you have the story about being cast out of the synagogue and everything else. And there I think Judaioi means Jews.
Yeah. A final thought when it comes to Luke Acts, and I'm wondering if you think that Dom might be onto something here. I take recent things that come at me and then I throw them to other scholars to see what they think.
Okay.
And Dom said that he thinks that Luke Acts undermines Paul's own words about him seeing the Lord. Have I not seen the Lord? And Paul clearly seems to imply some way, shape, or form he actually saw the Lord now that he's in
If only we knew what he meant.
Exactly, because in Acts, it's like they narrate it like, who are you? Like he doesn't even know what he's
blinded.
So
Right.
how does he see him if he's blinded? And Dom thinks that like this guy doesn't even realize that whoever's authoring this is not getting Paul right here, because Paul's like, have I not seen the Lord? How are you going to see him if you're blind? And like the story tells you can't even see him.
And to make this more complicated, in Galatians 1, when he talks about this moment of transition, he says, you wouldn't know this from the English translation. It says, God revealed his son in me, not to me, in me, which, given his idea of pneumatic possession, makes you wonder if it were an interior event. But then he has Christ was seen in Galatians and 1 Corinthians 15. So
Right.
it's, I don't know.
Yeah, what is going on with that? And then Dr. Tabor wrote his dissertation, and it made me think about this whole 2 Corinthians. Is it in 2 Corinthians where he talks about I once knew a man?
Right.
And
Caught up to the third heaven.
yeah, he's not like,
I have a
overly-
friend who, right?
Yeah, like he according to Tabor, he says, I'm like not dogmatic about this, but this could be Paul saying about his conversion. It could be that he could be like kind of referring to like, I knew a man 14 years ago, like back in the day, and that, you know who it is. No way to know, but like if that is, it's so mystical, whether in the body or out. He doesn't even know what he's talking about.
If you're doing a heavenly tour, it's a good question, because flesh belongs in the sublunar realm. I mean, you've got to think in terms of Science 101 with antiquity. It's a geocentric universe. The lunar sphere is where this type of flesh resides. And if you go up to the third heaven, you're probably not in a body of flesh, because you can't drag it past the sphere of the moon. That's just simple physics.
Yeah, this is interesting. There's a lot. Paul's an interesting guy. And right now, Robin Faith Walsh is writing something about the moon pertaining to Paul. So I love all of you scholars. I mean, if it weren't for you, MythVision wouldn't be where it's at. So thank you. I'm certain there are more. Is there any reading recommendations you would refer someone on Luke Acts on how to like dive deeper into later dating or any of these?
Well, Purvo is, I think, really good on the later dating. Of course, it's hard to read a commentary recreationally, and as I remember, it's at least 2 inches thick. But I think that would be a gold standard. For an extremely conservative denial of any clash between Paul and Acts, you could go to Martin Hengel. And in terms of rethinking the authorship of the Gospels, of which Luke is one, there's now work on thinking of these not as community documents, but as documents of literati, which they would be, which is a tiny upper crust of Greco-Roman society. And that upends the apple cart completely.
Did you read The Origins of Christian Literature by Robin Faith Walsh? Did you like it?
Yes, I loved it.
Okay. Wow. That's why I started to get the hint from you, because I think it wasn't long ago that people were in that kind of German folklore, the
romantic,
right. Yes. And now I read her work and I was like,
it's such I encounter new ideas and I have to think with them a while before I can switch my head around. But it made so much sense prima facie, right? That, I mean, these are written documents. And if you strip away, I mean, professional New Testament studies is so Germanic. I mean, it was born in the Reformation. It's still a Protestant club for the most part, despite, God help us, Jews and Catholics even,
right.
Being New Testament scholars. So I think what Robin did is situate the scholarship in that German Romantic matrix very, very compellingly. And then she also situated these ancient texts in a native habitat, which would be literate reading groups. And it's a really interesting book. And it's 1/10 the size of Purvo's commentary.
Exactly.
Another good reason to read it.
Go read Robin Faith Walsh. Thank you so much for this. I know she'll appreciate that. And I think even Bart Ehrman, I got him on record saying, yep, I think she's on the money. I think she's on the right path. So I think scholarship's heading down that. I know. And
that's a huge, it changes everything. It really does.
It does. Especially when Bart, his models that he's been built off of for so long with using a certain kind of he still thinks there's probably some type of possible communities that have utilized those texts, but not necessarily that the texts were written out the gate with this. And it might make sense when I first threw this in one of my videos where I said, is this pro-Pauline, anti-this and whatnot? And you're like, well, we don't know. We don't know if Mark really knew this. And her position doesn't say that it doesn't. She's saying we need to stop thinking in the models that we've thought that way. Did they have these sources? Maybe.
Don't know.
We don't know.
Don't know. Part of it too is, again, New Testament scholarship being born in the Renaissance, which has this idea of history and going, getting back to what actually happened.
Right.
And if you tether those texts to a community that has circulating oral traditions, that somehow that enables you to go back and back and back and back, it's a relief. Right. To be able to think that there's that type of correspondence between what happened historically and what you have represented in the text, but that doesn't make it true.
Thank you.
Thank you to those who contributed in the GoFundMe on making this trip possible for these 12 recordings with Paula Fredriksen. I want to give a special shout out to you. Your names are chiseled in history. I also want to thank everybody who has become a patron of MythVision, making stuff like this possible, taking academic work that is hiding behind all of these scholarship, all of these colleges, and making it public knowledge for everybody to learn.